Sarah, I'm very happy that you found time to talk about your project in Petra. I went to Petra in 2018 with Jack Green, and we were tracking Petra Church, the Temple of the Winged Lion, and of course we saw the Petra Garden and Pool Complex. At that time you were excavating with your team, and can you tell more about the Petra Garden and Pool Complex? Because 5 years passed and probably you have all kinds of updates.
Yeah, so we were in the field in 2018, and we actually just had another field or a study season in 2023 this past summer. So we are really, at least my interest in the project, I'm really digging into what makes the site, and especially what happened to the garden after it stopped being used as a garden. So its transformation from this elite zone of pleasure to a dumping ground of architectural material, perhaps some refuse associated with industry, and then a grazing field in the middle of this monumental city. So it's a really interesting question or idea of how cities transform over time.
What we know about the complex and the area of Petra, because that part of Petra used to be a commercial area of the town, and how it transformed through time. Of course, through ancient time. We're not talking about the modern time. Can you hear me? Or?
I'm sorry, you broke up a bit. Can you
repeat that? I broke up. So how the commercial area of Petra transformed during the time?
Okay, so the Petra Garden and Pool is part of this monumental complex that's currently known as the Great Temple. The garden itself seems to date to the end of the 1st century BCE, and it seems that perhaps there was some evidence of a Nabataean presence before that, but perhaps during the reign of Aratus IV, the garden was built, and it was this elite space associated with this beautiful large pool that was probably accessible through the courtyard of the Great Temple, which may or may not have actually been a temple. But this area of the city was also extremely important because you can imagine it was just absolutely full of life. There's a number of really important temples in the area, Castor Bent, the Temple of the Winged Lions, that are probably in use at this time. We know that there are villas on tour overlooking the site. We know that there are more houses on the North Ridge to the north of the garden and pool complex. And this was a really vibrant and thriving area of the city that was this mix of domestic life, of religious life, economic, cultural interactions, and perhaps elite spaces, if not for maybe for the king and queens of Petra, maybe for some other member of the Nabataean elite. But it was really dynamic in the late 1st century BCE and throughout the 1st century CE. And then the Romans annexed the Nabataean kingdom in 106 CE, so early in the 2nd century. There are some changes that start to occur across Petra, and the garden and pool complex is one of them. There does seem to be this Roman period renovation where some new aspects are added to the garden and the pool especially, but it probably falls out of use pretty soon after that. So perhaps by the 3rd century CE, we just see this change in how Petra functions, or this area of Petra functions. And it becomes more of just an area where people can deposit their refuse, they can dump the byproducts of any sort of industry. We do seem to have some sort of lime deposits that are perhaps the byproducts of some sort of workshop nearby. But either way, it's quite a dramatic transformation from this elite pleasure garden to a more utilitarian industrial area that meets the needs of what we might call sub-elite individuals. So not necessarily those that have a lot of power and money, but are engaged in the normal day-to-day aspects of urban life, including even some grazing of herds. You can imagine goats or sheep. I find this area, there's even today we see lots of vegetation in the garden and pool complex site. So good place for shepherds to bring their flocks through and get a nice little tasty snack in the middle of the city.
Where they got the water from for the garden, because that garden and the vegetation around it should have been watered regularly, and we know that Petra is pretty arid city, and the whole area is very arid.
Yeah, so the Nabataeans were really quite skilled hydraulic engineers, as you well know.
Yeah.
But there are a couple. We're still figuring out exactly how the Nabataeans got water to the garden and the pool, especially because the pool would have just required a massive amount of water in. We started to trace some of the piping systems that cross between from the Great Temple into the garden and pool complex. We see there's been some work that Sue Alcock at Brown has done in the upper market that has identified some pipes there as well that might all be feeding into water that is used in the pool. There's numerous cisterns and water storage locations across Petra that we still see, and I imagine there's more yet that we haven't found even. So I imagine there is probably a water collection that is on some higher elevation, maybe somewhere near Zentor, that is feeding some water down into the pool and supplying not just to the pool, but obviously watering the garden and then meeting the needs of the people that lived or were active in the Great Temple and whatever sort of monumental architecture that there was in what are now known as the upper and the middle markets. I think for the plants themselves, the Nabataeans probably weren't trying to necessarily create a garden that was super exotic in a way that they would have needed, that the plants that they were installing needed a lot of water. I imagine they were probably plants that could survive relatively well in the more arid environment that is what we see in modern day Petra. And some of the work that Jennifer Ramsey has done looking at the botanical remains has shown that they are probably planting local plants and flowers. So the oleanders that we see all over Petra now with those beautiful pink flowers might have been a plant that would have been installed in the garden. And you can imagine, even if they are local, they are quite dramatic and they are beautiful and they are really quite full. There's an oleander bush that is still in the middle of the garden and pool complex, and Leanne Badal, director of the garden and pool complex excavations, working with conservators, has really been trying to tackle that oleander plant for a year, but it keeps coming back no matter what they do. So it just speaks to how well those oleander bushes are meant to do in an arid environment. Yeah.
When did you join the PGPC project, which started, in fact, in 1998, when excavation of the lower market disclosed the monumental swimming pool?
Yeah, so Leanne Vidal has been working she worked with the Brown project at the Great Temple, and then she started the project for her dissertation research in what is now known as the Petra Garden and Pool. I came in 2013. It was actually my first year digging in Petra. It was really exciting. I've been working with pottery, so I've always had a pottery component of this project. Leanne works with a number of individuals that work with ancient ceramics. And I was one of them. I was an assistant to the ceramicist, Pamela Koulianos, in 2013. And I've come back every season since. Unfortunately, due to circumstances, our field project in 2015 had to be rescheduled. So it was, I've been on the project, we've been on the field, in the field in 2013, 2018, and then 2023 this past summer. But I've been working with the material and with the project directors for a decade now.
So you have a milestone, so to say.
Yes.
It's a small milestone. And how can you recap the period from 2013 until this year? You had 3 or 4 digging seasons, because between 2018 and 2023 we had the COVID hiatus, which in a way obstructed many research teams, many projects, not only in Jordan, not only in this part of the world, but generally people were isolated and prevented to travel freely. What's your recap about Petra swimming pool project and garden project in the past 10 years? Now you became more senior in that field. Now you're a senior researcher.
Yeah, yes, when I just joined the project, it was my first year as a master's student, so I was very early in my career. And this year I defended my dissertation, so it's from the very start of my graduate career to the very end. It really, the garden and pool complex project really bookends that period of life for me. Obviously, I'm going to continue to work at the garden and pool, and I'm really invested in the site, but it is just really synonymous with all of my work in that really particular period in my life. But I've had the opportunity to grow as a scholar through this project, from coming on originally as a volunteer to now being assistant director to Leanne. And it's really, my knowledge of Petra has just gotten so much deeper over time, and so much of that is through my work with this material and the ceramics in particular, to understand what materials the Nabataeans were producing and consuming, where they found value, how they expressed all so much.
Okay, it's a little bit interrupted, but what are your plans in coming years? Are you planning to dig in 2024, or you're just going to gather soil and analyze the finds?
So this past year was a study season, and Leanne typically has gone every other year into the field. So 2024, there are no plans to go into the field. So we would probably be considering 2025 at the earliest to go back. And a lot of things are up in the air for me about where I am professionally. If I have a job at a university and where I am in that process. But I would obviously, I would love to do, there are a handful of questions remaining about the garden and how it was arranged and connected to the sites on either side of it. We have a pretty good idea of how the garden connects to the Great Temple, but less so how it connects with what is known as the Middle Market. So there's a number of research questions we still have still. That being said, I really admire the way Leanne has always done every other season, because it gives you the opportunity to look at what you found and sit with it and consider it and really understand specific objects' role in the history of the site. And I think that is a much more ethical way of approaching archaeology, and a really careful and cautious approach, which is incredible when you think about how much we owe the objects that we excavate as we remove them from their ancient homes and try to understand what they meant, but taking the time to carefully sit with that material and think through how it contributed to the making of the site is so important, and only feasible when you have the time to think carefully and consider.
To the south of the garden, there's a residential quarter. And how many villas you and your team excavated there? You mentioned that the area around the lower market and upper markets, and of course, Great Temple was also a residential area. The palace was from the opposite side, close to the Temple of the Winged Lion, according to some researchers. I'm not going to be specific, but this is the plan. And how many villas did you excavate?
Well, are you talking about on the North Ridge?
I'm talking about the south of the garden, the area on the high sandstone ridge.
So I wasn't a part of those projects.
Okay.
It was but we do get a lot of wash off or runoff of material from the Zontord villas to the pool and garden. So there was definitely some connectivity between the site, whether it was real or purposeful or accidental. I think maybe a bit of the latter, certainly in the years since the garden was used as a garden. But that's my real engagement with the site. But I know there are quite a number. I think there's four villas up on the ridge behind the garden and pool complex that are just phenomenal. They are massive structures.
Regarding the garden, was that a public space or part of a shrine? Because the Great Temple is on the right side of the garden.
I think most of what we know now, we would call it like a semi-public space. So there are ways that people could have entered that area, but it probably wasn't open for just any Nabataean or person that's visiting Petra to come into the garden, you can imagine that whoever was in control of that space probably wasn't restricted entrance to it. It also preserves the site and makes it a little bit easier for the garden to come across as this elite place and really important space, if not just everyone can enter it. But I do think that there are ways, it wasn't necessarily a private space that nobody besides the owners of the area could enter. We're still really trying to understand the relationship between who had access to that space and who didn't, and why those regulations may have been in effect. And I think that's something that will become clear once we have a better idea of what's going on in what's called the middle market. So on the other side of the east side of the garden and pool complex. As of right now, I don't think anyone has plans really to dig into that, but we can look at the edge of the garden and pool complex site to see how it is connected and really sort of refine our understanding of those connections, and that might clarify who has access to this space, who doesn't, and what activities they might be doing in that space. So what was its role besides being a really nice place to spend time, because surely it was more than just a nice place to sit down in the hot sun.
It was probably a kind of a private club or a country club.
Maybe.
Then, are you related to the project of Temple of the Winged Lion, or you have completely separate roles? Because we both know that Acor is in charge of the Petra Church and the Temple of the Winged Lion.
Yeah, I've followed the Temple of the Winged Lions project with interest in recent years, and there was a point when I was considering writing my dissertation on some of the material. I am not currently involved. There is an amazing ceramicist who is looking at that material now, Caroline Durand, and she's going to do fantastic things with that pottery. So I'm really excited to see what she does with it. I am associated with the Petra North Ridge project's excavations that were directed by Megan Perry and Tom Parker, who is now passed. I'm working with Megan on the publications of those excavations on the North Ridge, which have a handful of Nabataean domestic complexes, 2 Roman period domestic complexes or houses, and one so-called villa urbana. So this big villa, this elite space on the North Ridge that is probably similar to, it might be similar to what we see at Zontour, but it's where the 2 Aphrodite statues were recovered in 2016.
What's going on with the Petra North Ridge project? Since you're part of that project as well and a very busy person, you can update us more about the North Ridge project, because I've been following that, and I wrote a couple of articles about statues found in that part of Petra back in 2000, maybe 20 or no 18, and recently I also published something about that.
Yeah, they had a workshop at Acor a couple months back, which I think you might have actually attended.
I attended that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting seeing imagining what the colors of those statues might have been, and they've done some fantastic work with an art historian from the University of Georgia, Mark Abbey. Megan Perry's really dug into the archaeological context, and I'm blanking on his name for a second. a conservator that's worked at the Met as well, trying to understand how these two statues of Aphrodite that have a pretty different appearance might have found their way into this dump pit that dates around the period of the years after the earthquake in 363. My work with the Petra Northridge project has primarily been on the perhaps less flashy materials. So I'm really looking at a lot of the ceramics. I was trained by Tom Parker, and I've taken over the study of that material since his passing. And I'm also looking at the how the domestic spaces were built and when they were used and why. And my dissertation research was actually partially on how those Nabataean and Roman period structures recycled Nabataean refuse in their floors and fills. So a way of recycling this material that would have otherwise been possibly a hindrance in an ancient city, if you can imagine this really busy and thriving ancient city, and if there are piles of refuse everywhere, it would be hard to navigate, especially on the North Ridge, which has, it is quite, the topography can be challenging in some senses to move around it, but the Nabataeans, like many of the people across the ancient world, recycled that material into their ancient floors to raise the surface level and to build new aspects of their structure, which is just quite ingenious. And they were very good at managing the resources that they had, not just water, but also just the byproducts of their daily life. They turned what could have been a hindrance or something that really impeded daily life into something that helped sustain it.
There are a number of Nabataean and Roman era tombs. Also, we have the Reed Church, which is of course different from Petra Church. How old is the Reed Church?
So the Reed Church is actually not. Oh, sorry. Megan Perry and Patricia Buckay excavated the Ridge Church, I believe in the 90s, early 2000s, and the publication has come out actually quite recently. It's a gorgeous publication. But it seems that in the years, perhaps in the years before the earthquake, and then certainly in the years after, this area of Petra really became important for the growing Christian population in the Petra region. And the Ridge Church was in use at the same time as the Petra Church and what is now known as the Blue Chapel, that has these beautiful blue granite Nabataean, they're probably Nabataean columns that were perhaps used in one of a Nabataean temple. The Christian population was quite used to borrowing architectural elements from pagan structures and reusing them in their churches. But by the time the churches come into their own and they become quite thriving places for the Christian community, we see that the domestic life on the North Ridge has mostly subsided. So a massive earthquake struck the Levant in 363 CE, and it really ended the use of the North Ridge as a place for people to live, at least as far as we can tell. And so after the earthquake, there was probably some minimal reoccupation of some of the Nabataean and Roman period buildings, but the main activity on the ridge is associated with those three churches. And we also know that the urn tomb was repurposed as a church around this time. And then, lest we forget, the Jebel Haroun also had a monastery there. So we can imagine that the city of Petra in the 4th, 5th, and 6th century is this sort of early Byzantine period in the city was quite a different environment than the 1st century BC, 1st century CE Nabataean Petra. It was really quite a shifted community.
What happened with the population of Petra? Because during the Nabataean and Roman time, we witnessed increase in the population, and later on maybe we have the opposite trend, especially after the earthquake.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Surveys of around the Petra region really suggest that in the 1st century BCE, and especially the 1st century CE, and even more so the second half of the 1st century CE, so circa like 50 to 106 CE, the Nabataeans are really just spreading into every crevice of not just the city of Petra, but all of the areas surrounding it, into even less agriculturally productive areas out by Udra. It's a site that's about 15 kilometers east of Petra. And so the Nabataeans really had this, like, the population must have been growing and expanding. And that kind of changes with the Roman annexation of the Nabataean kingdom. We have less evidence of people living out in the rural sites in the later 2nd and 3rd centuries. And by the time we get to the Byzantine period, there's some reoccupation of some hinterland or rural sites, but it seems like the population has really moved eastward towards Udra, where there was a fortress around 400 CE the Romans were really good at building, and they built this massive, huge fortress there, and the opportunity to trade and to engage with the Roman soldiers who lived there probably drew a lot of the population that maybe had been living in Petra pre-earthquake to out further east to where that fortress was. And it seems like most of the agriculture moved that way as well. We really don't know much of, certainly people were living in Petra in the Byzantine period when we have the churches on the North Ridge, but we don't really have much archaeological evidence of where that was. Like I said, most of our, on the North Ridge, all of our excavated sites, occupation ends with the massive earthquake of 363, and there's some sporadic reoccupation of select portions of, for instance, the Villa Urbana, where the statues were recovered, but it remains frustratingly unclear if people were living there or if it was temporary. They were just sort of gathering and stashing materials, or if instead they were, rebuilding some sort of life there. I think I hate to say this, but we just need more excavation in Petra that will tell us more about how the early Byzantine or the Byzantine population might have lived and interacted. And also more excavation of the area out by Udra. There's been a lot of attention paid to the fortress itself, and there's been some incredible survey work that's been done by this joint Jordanian-Dutch team out there. But I don't think they have done much excavation of domestic sites out there. I'm not up to date on everything that they've been doing, but there's certainly so much potential out there.
What's the future of two statues of Aphrodite?
Well, they're going to stay in Jordan. So there was one, there's been one that's installed in the Petra Museum, and I believe the other one will join it in the Petra Museum. When I was last there in the summer, they were still in discussions and making final arrangements as to where it would go, but it's considered best practices in the museum world now to try to keep objects as close to their site of origin as possible. So it would be really lovely if they were both in the Petra Museum together and were standing together. But there is something to be said about having one in the Jordan Museum that could advocate for Petra and Nabataean culture. I imagine that more people perhaps go to the Jordan Museum than the Petra Museum. So the opportunity to see one, if you don't have the time to go to Petra, would be really lovely for
they can split time
to Jordan.
Maybe they can split time. So one will be in Amman and another one in Petra, in the modern museum built by Japanese. So they can switch from time to time. One will be in Amman and another one in Petra. I'll send you another link in a few minutes, because this one is going to expire in 2 minutes. I don't want you to get cut. So I'll send you another link.
Sounds good.
So this time we're going to talk about the Nabataean art, because in Roman and especially Greek chronicles, they were described as uncivilized and unsophisticated barbarians. What do you think about the Nabataean art at Khirbet at Tanur?
Well, I'm a bit biased, but I think the Nabataean art at Khirbet at Tanur is just phenomenal. I've been so honored to have the ability to work with it for a couple of years now, and it's just this perfect snapshot of a people that were so well aware of the world around them and were keenly interested in what other cultures were doing, the Ptolemies, the Greeks, the Romans, the Achaemenid, the Parthians, the Palmyrans, and also very interested in telling their own story with their art at the same time. So the Greeks and Roman authors may have dismissed the Nabataeans, but our evidence shows that they were just nothing short of extraordinary masters of their own culture and their own politics and messaging, and that really, it shows so clearly in their art. The statues and the architectural and the carved elements at the temple of Khirbet at Tanur is just spectacular beyond all imagining, and what the temple must have looked like back in the 2nd century CE. I can only imagine. I wish I could see it, but the elements are so carefully and thoughtfully carved, and we see this beautiful floral and vegetative motif that just covers all aspects of the altar there, and this really careful and purposeful messaging of choosing which deities, Nabataean deities, to display on the inner temenos and on the altar itself. and interpreting the deities that may have some external influences from the Egyptians, from the Palmyrans, from the Romans, but using them to fit a narrative that is exceptionally Nabataean.
Yeah.
So
Do you think?
we have.
Sorry. Do you think they were Nabataean deities?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think for too long, the gods of other more well-known cultures have been ascribed to Nabataean statues, and I think it's now time that we look at the art of the Nabataeans and try to understand it as they would have. I'm really reluctant to necessarily label uh, the statues at Khirbet Nur as, for example, Dushara or a lot, but I think there are certainly Nabataeans that visited the site and saw Dushara in the altar as this one of the principal deities of the Nabataean kingdom, named after the Ashara mountains that surround Petra. And uh, so Nelson Glick, who originally excavated the site, called them called the main god Hadad, of the main god of the Nabataean temple at Tanur, Hadad. Other people have called him Kos because there was an inscription found on the site that predates the site by about 100 years, or the big majestic period of the site. And so it refers to this Edomite god. So uh, uh, Glick named the god after a Syrian god. We have an Edomite god, which is, about the same region, but it is a Nabataean temple. So I think there's some pretty good evidence that it was the Nabataean god Dushara that was
Yeah.
depicted there. There's still so much work that needs to be done to make that claim for sure, and we may never have that evidence. And I imagine many of the people that were visiting the site, if they were Nabataean, they probably saw a Nabataean god. If they were not Nabataean, they may have saw a Roman god or a Palmyran god or a Ptolemaic god. But I think the intention of the Nabataeans who built that temple was to create something that was explicitly Nabataean. Yeah.
We also know that Nelson Glick, a well-known archaeologist and a pioneer in Middle Eastern archaeology, traveled to Petra. He also traveled to check the site of Khirbet Tanur. What were his accounts about Petra? Let's say his first account.
I have to admit that I'm not actually as familiar with some of his
Yeah.
takes on Petra. I've read I read his journal about his excavation at Tanur, and because my work focused specifically on the site of Tanur,
Yeah.
although I'm very curious about what he thought of Petra. I know he looked at the architecture, surely, but at Tanur, his recording of the excavation is quite phenomenal. It's very dramatic in the way of only archaeologists in the 1930s can be. There's this massive storm. He's excavating in the spring, right? So there's spring
Yeah.
rains that hit the region, and he talks about uh, the ancient gods making the sides of his tent right on the top of Tanur shake with their power, and it's just really um, it's over the top in the best way possible. That I would never write something like that in my excavation journals, but it's a delightful narrative to read now. Also, he very carefully records when he found different elements in the temple. So we have photos. I've seen photos of the eagle wrestling with the serpent statue that came out of Tanur, that being discovered. We have photos of him and the team of workers that helped excavate the site. And Nelson Glick never actually published the final report on Khirbet at Tanur, but this amazing scholar out of Oxford, Judith Mackenzie, who has unfortunately since passed. Yeah, she did this incredible publication on the site, and she really carefully made sure that she was able to identify all of the workers that had worked with Glick in the 1930s, going through all of his archives and journals and just the scraps of paper to make sure that she knew everybody's name that was a part of it. So there's been a lot of really phenomenal work that's done on the site, and I'm really just so honored to have been able to put together a tiny little article that contributes or summarizes in some ways what they've done.
Did you find what finds did you excavate in 2018 and 2023 at Petra Pool and Garden site?
So those excavations were, we didn't excavate this past year. It was a study season.
Yeah.
So we were looking
2018.
at, yeah, trying to better understand. The purpose of a lot of what we were doing in 2018 was to understand how the garden connected to the pool, and how the garden tried to connect to the what is now known as the Middle Market, as well as we were excavating in this area that was in particularly looking to better understand what happened to the site after the three as after it was certainly people continue to come through, obviously. So I have been working with the pottery in particular, and we are really fortunate in the garden and pool complex to have this long chronological sequence that goes all the way from the late 1st century BCE, like through maybe the 6th or 7th century. We even have some sherds that may be Islamic. We're still doing further research, but it's a pretty rare sequence in Petra archaeology where we have that full length of time. Other projects do have it as well, but we're really leaning in to try to understand how ceramics were produced and consumed over the history of Petra. Petra was just this amazing producer of ceramics, and they're perhaps best well known for the Nabataean painted fineware bowls, which are simply gorgeous and exquisite, and they're covered with a lot of these vegetative motifs that I think I've been playing around with the idea of, I wonder if this embrace of the vegetative motif connects with Nabataean connotations of power, and their ability to control this arid landscape really makes them exceptional. It's the idea of garden and flower and vegetation as a source of their power. That perhaps my next project that I'm looking into. But they also continue to make this really productive and and quite useful pottery for centuries, even after they stopped using the vegetative motif on their pottery. And looking into how that industry was sustained through that period, through this time of great transition in Petra, you know, when we go from Nabataeans controlling their own city to it becoming, falling under Roman control. There's so much of interest that we think of the stability of these individuals that are working in an industry that is so vital to the continuation of urban life. You know, ceramics were used for almost every aspect in every corner of urban life. How an industry not just survived but thrived in periods when other parts of the city were really hurting.
And for the end, do you think that we have a discontinuity in occupation and development in Petra after Nabataean, Roman, Byzantine periods, and after early Islamic periods? Because they're, yes, please.
Sorry. I mean, I think you were probably about to say this, but Michela Sinibaldi's
Yes.
work, Islamic Beta, has perhaps thrown into question this idea that Petra was, you know,
Abandoned.
Yeah.
She questions that.
Yeah, her work is really interesting and it's changing all sorts of ideas and connotations of what Islamic Petra might have been. And I think she's really, really on to something with her work of looking at where the mosques were in the Islamic period. I've been fortunate enough I looked at some of her late Byzantine pottery this summer, and so I'm loosely aware of what she's working on, and it was just mind blowing to me how much my assumption of what Petra was during the Islamic period was just so fundamentally wrong. I just wasn't looking in the right spots. And you think about it, and of course the Islamic population is going to that's well protected and has all these natural resources. So it's really exciting continue to grow and evolve with ever more research that's being done.
Thank you so much for the first time. Thank you so much for the initial conversation. I'm planning to host you more in the future. We're going to keep in touch, and I'll send you the link once I publish articles about projects that you were involved in. I'm planning to run also many articles, not only one. But I think this week I'm going to run the first in a series of articles on projects that you and your team are involved with, and we'll keep in touch. And hopefully we're going to see each other in Amman in 2024.
Yes, I hope so. That's the plan.
Thank you so much. All the best.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.